On the morning of January 15th, 1947, a lady named Betty Bersinger was walking with her daughter in a Los Angeles neighborhood called Lamont Park when they came across one of the most horrific scenes in true crime history. What they first thought was a discarded mannequin laying a few feet away from the sidewalk turned out to actually be the severely mutilated, blood-drained, and lifeless body of a young woman named Elizabeth Short. The media later dubbed her the Black Dahlia, and the mystery of who killed her and why still remains unsolved. Now, since the story is pretty well known, if you want to skip around, I do have chapters that you can use. Now, there are loads of theories about what happened to her, but I only want to cover 3, and 2 of them are fairly new. One is from a British lawyer and author named Pew Eatwell, and the other is from a writer named Larry Harnish. Both theories are very interesting. Alright, now if you want a refresher on the story or have never heard it before, here we go. Elizabeth Short was born on July 29, 1924 in Hyde Park, Boston. She was the third of 5 daughters born to Cleo Alvin Short Jr. and Phoebe May Sawyer. Cleo was an ex-Navy sailor who changed careers and started building miniature golf courses. But after the 1929 stock market crash, which had a devastating impact on families leading to widespread unemployment, poverty and hardship, Cleo changed careers again, and he became a magician, because one day he just disappeared. His car was found abandoned on the Charleston Bridge, and the police believed that he jumped into the Charles River. Phoebe was then left to take care of the family on her own, but she seems to have managed fine because she worked as a bookkeeper and kept things together. However, to make things a little harder, Elizabeth suffered from bronchitis and severe asthma attacks, which was so bad that she had to undergo lung surgery at the age of 15, after which the doctor suggested that she periodically relocate to a milder climate to prevent further respiratory problems. So Phoebe then sent Elizabeth to spend winters with family friends in Miami, Florida, and she stayed there for the next 3 years. And during this time, Elizabeth dropped out of high school. Then in late 1942, Phoebe received a letter from a magician. Cleo had suddenly reappeared, and he sent Phoebe a letter of apology, saying that he was alive and well and had moved to California to start a new life. Now, I'm not sure what Phoebe thought about that, but Elizabeth saw it as an opportunity to reconnect with her father. So at 18 years old, Elizabeth made her way to Vallejo, California, to live with Cleo. Shockingly though, they didn't really get along, and Elizabeth moved out in early January 1943. She then took up a job at the base exchange at Camp Cook, which is now known as the Vandenberg Space Force Base, and she briefly lived with an Army Air Force sergeant. Now with a title like that, you might think, yeah, he sounds like a nice guy. He was not. He was a dickhead who beat and abused her. So by late 1943, Elizabeth was on the move again, this time heading to Santa Barbara, where she was arrested in September 1943 for drinking at a local bar while underage. In case you don't know, legal age for drinking in America is 21. Now, juvenile authorities tried to send her back to Massachusetts, but she instead returned to Florida. It was then in Florida where Elizabeth met Major Matthew Michael Gordon Jr., a decorated Army officer. And if you're thinking what I'm thinking, not another one. Gordon, though, was actually pretty good to her. He was so good to her, in fact, that Elizabeth told her friends that Gordon had written to her, asking her to marry him while he was recovering from injuries sustained in a plane crash. Elizabeth accepted. Gordon then died in a second plane crash in 1945. Jesus Christ, dude. The shit that this woman had to go through. Then in July 1946, Elizabeth moved back to California to visit Army Air Force Lieutenant Joseph Gordon Fickling. And if you're thinking what I'm thinking, not another one, he was just an acquaintance. Elizabeth would then spend the last 6 months of her life in Southern California, mostly around the Los Angeles area, working as a waitress. Now, the timeline of how Elizabeth spent these final 6 months is quite hazy, but it is important because it will give us a little more perspective when it comes to one of our main suspects, or theories. So if the details are slightly out of order, I do apologize. But Elizabeth and her friend and roommate named Marjorie Graham started moving around from place to place, and they spent some time living with a guy named Mark Hansen. And if you're thinking, oh god, not another Army Air Force sergeant, he was not. He was a multi-millionaire who owned a number of movie theaters and nightclubs, and as the author Pew Eatwell puts it, a powerful Hollywood mover and shaker with connections to the fringes of the Los Angeles underworld. Now that does make him sound like some kind of Sin City villain, so who was Mark Hansen really? Well, other than the businesses he owned, he also had several rooming houses and his own apartment just off of Hollywood Boulevard on Carlos Avenue. He was separated from his wife, who had a house on the Hollywood Hills with their 2 daughters, and people who knew Hansen said that he had a pretty great lifestyle in his apartment. Even Hansen himself stated that he rented some of his rooms out to several girls. However, according to Pew, it was also said that if he liked a girl's looks, he would invite them to stay with him, with the promise that they were going to make it as big movie stars. Then sooner or later, they would get kicked out or end up as dancers in one of his nightclubs. So how did Elizabeth Short get mixed up with this guy? Well, what many newspapers claimed is that Elizabeth was some kind of aspiring actress, since that fits the image of LA so well. But in fact, there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that she had any ambitions to be an actress. She never attended any castings or did any classes, or even got professional headshots. So it's hard for some people to understand, but the vast majority of people moving to Los Angeles don't want to be actors. By the way, that was a quote from the RealLosAngelesTours.com. So according to the Black Dahlia in Hollywood, how Elizabeth Short actually ended up with Mark Hansen is that Elizabeth and her friend and roommate Marjorie Graham moved out of the Hawthorne apartments that they stayed at to the Figueroa Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. Then a musician named Sid Zed let the girls stay at his home for a while, but eventually he took them up to Hollywood and introduced them to Mark Hansen. He told Mark Hansen that he didn't have enough room at his place and asked if Mark could put them up at his home. Hansen then agreed, and the girls moved into the Carlos Avenue house. Hansen said that they stayed for about a week or maybe a little bit longer, like 10 days, but after a while, he asked them to leave because, quote, "This Graham girl, she was inclined to be liquored up, and I didn't like it at all. And this Short girl, she always had some undesirable looking character waiting for her outside and bringing her home." Now, Mark Hansen's friend, a movie bit player named Ann Toth, who also lived with him at the house on Carlos Avenue, said, quote, "Well, Marjorie drank up all of Mark's liquor, so he kicked her out. So out Betty went too. I don't blame him." However, Ann also told investigators this: Mark Hansen really liked Elizabeth. He had a yen for her, but when interviewed, he acted as if he had no interest in her at all. When he was asked, and I'm not sure who asked this, I think it's the police, but when he was asked if she was a sexy type girl, Hansen replied with, "Well, I don't know if she was a sexy type girl. She appeared to be a very nice girl. She appeared to be a more domestic type girl. Well, I thought she was fair looking, average. If it wasn't for her teeth, she had bad teeth. Other than that, she was beautiful." What kind of fucking question is that? It's like the LAPD or like the real life police squad.
That evening we caught Mimi Du Jour's show at the Club Flamingo. We hoped to talk with her would be half as revealing as her act.
Yeah?
Mimi Du Jour?
Yeah.
I'm Lieutenant Drebin. This is Captain Hawken, Police Squad.
Is this some kind of bust?
Yes, it's very impressive, but we'd just like to ask a few questions.
Was she a sexy type girl? I'll never be able to get this idea out of my mind now that Leslie Nielsen was the lead detective on this case. Anyway, a inspector named Jemison, his report says about this whole conversation, quote, "Anne and her friend, Leo Himes, state that Mark was crazy about her and jealous of her, and that Mark is a man who must have what he wants." Beth then told Ann Toth that Mark Hansen was trying to make her. I have no idea what that means. I assume that's some 1940s slang, but Mark Hansen was so jealous that Elizabeth had to leave boyfriends at the corner so that he wouldn't see them. Hansen also had one of his tenants, who was in the dressmaking business, according to Jemison, make 2 dresses for Elizabeth, which she had fitted and made, but was never delivered to Elizabeth. Now, I don't really know why, but I feel like that's kinda creepy. Well, anyway, this jealousy thing was so bad that Anne also told Inspector Jemison that Beth was keeping company with a supposed cousin of hers. When Jemison asked if this cousin was actually a guy named Marvin Margolis, Anne replied, "Mm-hmm." Now, the reason he wanted to clarify that is because Hansen claimed that Elizabeth and Marvin both told him that Margolis was her cousin. He was under the impression that this guy was family of hers. So that right there suggests that Mark Hansen was in fact very jealous, and that Elizabeth had to lie to him. Now, after Elizabeth and Marjorie moved out, they did come back to Mark Hansen's house a few times. Ann Toth told investigators, quote, "They came over there one day, and they say they want to leave town. They were going to go east with this cousin. Then they visited with Anne, and then later on this Graham girl came over one night. Now Anne says she wasn't home, but she heard that Elizabeth was sitting eating dinner, and she was sitting eating dinner and crying. And then the next day, Mark Hansen came around there, and he carried a suitcase up, and Anne asks him, "What's this?" He says, "Can Elizabeth leave this here overnight? She's going away tomorrow and would like to leave these until tomorrow." Hansen apparently agreed. Later that night, when Anne Toth came back home, Elizabeth was in the house. She then asks Elizabeth, "I thought you were just going to leave your suitcases." And Elizabeth replies, "I didn't have no place to stay." And she asks Anne if she would mind if she stayed there. Anne claims that Elizabeth just kept on staying and staying and staying, and eventually moved over to the Chancellor Apartments. And then apparently, Anne says sometime later, she finds Elizabeth one night sitting and crying about being scared. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like she asked what about. But Elizabeth said that she was going to Oakland to a sister, and she also asked Anne if she could come back and stay at the house once she came back from Oakland, because she was scared of something. Now, unknown to Hansen, Anne actually found an apartment for Elizabeth at the Chancellor, after Hansen asked her to leave for the second time. She then came back to visit Mark and Anne later, telling them that she didn't like living at the Chancellor. Mark Hansen said he felt sorry for her and that there was bad company over there and he couldn't stand it. But then he gave Elizabeth a ride back to her apartment anyway and dropped her off outside. According to him, that was the last time that he ever saw her. He also claimed, just like Anne, that Elizabeth said that she was going to Oakland during the holidays to visit her sister. And Elizabeth also asked Hansen that when she came back if she could call him to see if he changed his mind about letting her stay at his house. However, Hansen said he never heard from her again. Now, like I said, the timeline of this is all very hazy, but this is supposed to have happened sometime in around November 1946. However, the last known confirmed sighting of Elizabeth was then on January 9th, 1947, when she was dropped off at the Biltmore Hotel by a guy named Robert Red Manley, a 25-year-old married pipe clamp salesman who she had apparently been dating. Now, I don't know if that is true, but there are two claims here. One claim says that they had just returned from a short trip to San Diego together, and the other claim says that he just offered her a ride home from San Diego where she had been staying with friends. Which one is true is unknown. Either way, Manley did drop Elizabeth off at the Biltmore Hotel on January 9th. Interestingly though, she also told him that she was going to meet one of her sisters there and then move east with her, but this time to Berkeley. While she was in the lobby, she was seen by hotel staff talking to someone on the hotel's phone, and then she was seen leaving the hotel on foot. Now, unfortunately, detectives were never able to identify who she was actually talking to or where she went after this, because her whereabouts for the next 6 days are unknown. So it stands to reason that this might have been the day that she was abducted by her killer. Although recently, new evidence has come out suggesting that she was actually seen by multiple people for a couple of days after she left the Biltmore. This evidence was supposedly released in the last few years from the DA's office, which had copies of some of the original police files, which of course the police later lost. Now, these are just alleged witness sightings, and I'm not sure if any of them are actually verified. But it seems at least that the people who knew her, like her friends, had no idea where she was for these 6 days. Then, on the morning of January 15th, Betty Bersinger and her daughter were walking down that street in the largely undeveloped Laymode Park at the time, and they stumbled upon the horrifically mutilated body of a young woman. In hindsight, we know this body was Elizabeth Short. However, at the time, the LAPD still hadn't ID'd the body yet. Now, this crime scene was excessively graphic, so yeah, viewer discretion is advised. But she was completely naked, her body was severed at the waist, and she was posed in a very strange position, with her legs spread apart and her elbows bent at right angles with her hands above her head. Her intestines were removed and tucked underneath her, and her face had been mutilated as well. Her killer gave her what is known as a Glasgow smile, basically like Heath Ledger's Joker, and a tattoo of a rose had been removed off of her thigh. Now, Elizabeth's autopsy also revealed ligature marks on her ankles, wrists, and neck, and an irregular laceration with superficial tissue loss on her right breast. There was also evidence of an assault of a sexual nature. In the end, though, it was determined that her cause of death was hemorrhaging from the lacerations to her face and the shock from the blows to her head. Strangely though, there was no blood found at the scene, and her body was completely drained of all of its blood as well. However, there was a cement sack found nearby some tire tracks in the dirt that contained watery blood. The witness, Betty Bersinger, said Elizabeth's body was so pale that she first thought the body was a discarded mannequin. Now, as I mentioned, her body was severed at the waist, and the upper half and the lower half was separated about a foot apart. Now, it is often reported that Elizabeth's body had been severed in half by a technique taught in the 1930s, called a hemicorporectomy, which is the basis for why many people believe that Elizabeth was murdered by some sort of doctor or surgeon. Now, while I would agree that a hemicorporectomy is considered a complicated surgery, the crime scene photos show, and the autopsy report states, that there was very little bruising on the incision line, suggesting that Elizabeth had been bisected after death. Now, the reason a hemicorporectomy or any amputation is complicated is because you're trying to keep the patient alive. Undoubtedly, this surgery would require precision and planning to cut the spinal cord precisely to minimize any neurological damage, and the procedure is known to cause significant blood loss. Now, that is just two examples of many as to why it is very difficult to perform the surgery successfully. However, it's not nearly as difficult if the person is already dead. Serial killers and weirdos dismember bodies all the time. But with that said though, if you've seen these crime scene photos, which I do not recommend, the cut is very clean. To someone like me, it does appear surgical. But I also wouldn't go as far as saying that that conclusively determines that it had to have been a doctor or a surgeon, because this could have been achieved by a butcher, for example. They did have electric saws and knives in the 1920s already, and this was 1947. But based on how surgical the cut looks, I would agree that it probably did require some sort of knowledge or skill to do it that cleanly. Well, anyway, the speculation does come up later. Let's get into the evidence. Because the most important thing to take away from her autopsy is that Elizabeth's body was washed clean with gasoline. That will be very important again soon. Now, it didn't take the FBI long to identify the body as Elizabeth Short, thanks to her fingerprints already being on file from her 1943 arrest in Santa Barbara. After that, the media contacted Elizabeth's mother Phoebe to try to get as much information about Elizabeth as possible, and they called Phoebe up and they told her that Elizabeth had won a beauty contest, and after they got as much personal information as they could, they finally told her what really happened to her. Elizabeth Short was murdered. What a bunch of dickheads. The media then wasted no time in creating a narrative around Elizabeth, calling her a Hollywood adventuress who prowled the Hollywood Boulevard, and they dubbed her the Black Dahlia. This was apparently due to Elizabeth's tendency to often wear black clothing, and also inspired by the recent release of a movie called The Blue Dahlia. And so, the Black Dahlia would go on to become a sensation that consumed headlines in newspapers for months, and the case would become one of California's most infamous unsolved mysteries. Now, I've said it before and I'll say it again. If California had a superpower, then it would be the power to create unsolved mysteries, and the Black Dahlia would be one of the finest examples of this power. For the Black Dahlia case in particular, there is even a little side mystery that comes along with it, and that is that some of the pages from the official police documents went missing. And according to Pew Eatwell, who actually received unredacted copies of the case files from an FBI Freedom of Information Act, almost all of these pages, according to her, are pertaining to Mark Hansen. Right now, before we get to him, we do need to go over the actual investigation, or at least how it has been shared with the public. Police started off by interviewing some of Elizabeth's friends and acquaintances, and most sources say that the police learned that Elizabeth had been missing for 6 days before her body was discovered. They therefore reasoned that she must have been kidnapped, tortured, and killed somewhere else before her body was dumped in Leimert Park. Now, during these interviews, this is when police also found out that Elizabeth had been staying with Mark Hansen for a while before she disappeared. And her friends also told police that Hansen was obsessed with her, and she was often rebuffing his sexual advances. However, the killer wasted no time trying to get attention, and on January 21st, a man claiming to be the killer phoned the Los Angeles Examiner. He congratulated them on their coverage of the case and warned them to expect some souvenirs of Beth Short in the mail. During this phone call, the killer would also promise that he would eventually turn himself in, But first, he wanted to play a game with the police and have them track him down. Then 3 days later, as promised, a suspicious manila envelope was discovered, addressed to the Los Angeles Examiner and other Los Angeles papers, with individual words that had been cut and pasted from newspaper clippings. The message on the face of the envelope read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings, letter to follow." This envelope contained Elizabeth's birth certificate, business cards, photographs, names written on pieces of paper, and an address book with the name Mark Hansen embossed on the cover. Now, obviously, Mark Hansen's name on that address book doesn't look good, and homicide detectives said that it was loaded with names of men and women, each of which will be checked for possible leads. However, this address book was dated 1937. It was 10 years old, and the police were fairly certain that Elizabeth was using this address book as a notebook. Some notes written in the address book were compared with letters that Elizabeth had sent, and it was determined that it was the same handwriting. However, what was more interesting about this envelope is that just like Elizabeth's body, the envelope was washed clean with gasoline, presumably to remove any fingerprints. However, despite the killer's efforts to clean the envelope, 4 fingerprints were lifted from the envelope and they were sent to the FBI for testing. But unfortunately, they were not in the FBI's database. And here we go again with the fingerprints. Just to put it out there now, there is no mention if Mark Hansen had a criminal record or not, if the police took his fingerprints or not to compare them to the envelope, or if he even had anything to do with the murder of Elizabeth Short. But police went to interview him anyway. The first question on their mind was she a sexy type girl? No, I'm kidding. They interviewed him on January 25th, 1947, in the presence of Ann Toth. Firstly, he denied any allegations that he was dating Elizabeth Short, and he also mentioned that he had not seen her since November 1946. He also mentioned to them that several girls have rented rooms at his house he owned on Carlos Avenue, but he never went out with any of them. But Elizabeth did have lots of dates. Hansen said, quote, "There was a language teacher that I know of, and with other persons, mostly hoodlums who I wouldn't even let into my house." Hansen admitted that the address book that was recovered by postal authorities, the one in the envelope, did in fact belong to him, but he told them that there was another memorandum and a calendar book that was also missing. Hansen said that he believes Elizabeth stole those too, and though objected to Hansen's depiction of Elizabeth, saying, quote, "She was a nice girl, she was quiet, she didn't drink and she didn't smoke, and we ought to look on the good side of people." Police then found photos of Elizabeth inside Mark Hansen's home, but he claimed he got them from an officer when a girl told him that she knew Beth. Hansen said that this girl told him that Elizabeth had been at the Howell Browning Hotel. So Hansen planned on taking these photos to this girl to see if she would identify the girl in the pictures as Beth Short to confirm that she actually was at the Howell Browning Hotel. And that's about all the information I could find on the police interview. Other than him being supposedly obsessed with her and very jealous of her, I don't know if this guy is suspicious. Yeah, so back to this envelope that was washed in gasoline. There was something else inside there that just sort of suggests the killer grabbed all the shit inside her purse and threw it into this envelope, because there was also a business card with the name Robert S. Gessinger on it. And when he was questioned, he also admitted that he knew Beth, but had not seen her since October 1946. So, since they couldn't really tie anything to Hansen or Gessinger, they were both ruled out as suspects. But the question remains though, if it is in fact true what Pew Eatwell claims, that some of these pages of the police investigation are missing and almost all of those pages are about Mark Hansen, then is that just a coincidence? Or is it, as she suggests, that there was a police cover-up? Maybe. Anyway, later the same day, the envelope with Elizabeth's things were sent into the Examiner. A handbag and a black suede shoe were reported to have been seen on the top of a garbage can in an alley a short distance away from Norton Avenue, which is about 2 miles or 3 kilometers away from the crime scene. These items had also been wiped clean with gasoline, destroying any fingerprints on them, and according to some sources, Hansen also confirmed that the purse and the shoe discovered in the alley were in fact Elizabeth Short's. And Toth also allegedly told investigators that Elizabeth had been rejecting sexual advances from Hansen and suggested that it was a potential motive for him to kill her. Now, I'm not sure how true that claim is, but if anybody knew Mark Hansen well enough to make that claim, it would probably be Ann Toth. Though again, I don't know how true that claim is. Then the next day on January 26th, Another letter was sent into the newspapers by the killer, but this time it was handwritten, and it said that the killer was going to turn himself in on January 29th at 10 a.m. The police then waited at the designated spot, but the killer never showed up. Instead, a final letter was sent to the newspapers saying, quote, "Have changed my mind. You would not give me a square deal. Dahlia killing was justified." Apparently, somewhere around this time as well, the LAPD received a phone call that said, "Don't bother chasing the Black Dahlia's murderer. You will never catch them." Then on March 14th, so about a month and a half later, an apparent suicide note, written in pencil on a piece of paper, was found inside of a shoe in a pile of men's clothing on the beach at the foot of Breeze Avenue in Venice. The note read, quote, "To whom it may concern, I have waited for the police to capture me for the Black Dahlia killing, but have not. I am too much of a coward to turn myself in, so this is the best way out for me. I couldn't help myself for that, or this. Sorry, Mary." Now, this pile of clothing was first seen by a beach caretaker, who then reported it to the lifeguard captain John Dillon. Unfortunately though, the clothes gave no indication of who they actually belonged to, so this was pretty much a dead end. Now, in addition to Hansen, the LAPD interviewed over 150 different men in the weeks following the murder. They also interviewed Robert Red Manley, the 25-year-old salesman who dropped Elizabeth off at the Biltmore Hotel, and is thought to be one of the last people to see Elizabeth alive. But after multiple polygraph examinations, he was cleared of suspicion. The LAPD also interviewed a couple of people found inside the address book, including a guy named Martin Lewis, who had been an acquaintance of Elizabeth's, but he was able to provide an alibi for the date of the murder. He was in Portland, Oregon, visiting his dying father-in-law. And this is pretty much where the investigation stalled. By the spring of 1947, Elizabeth's murder had become a cold case. A guy named Sergeant Finis Brown blamed the media for compromising the investigation through all of their probing of details and unverified reporting. Yeah, makes a lot of sense, and I'm sure that the media were also responsible for the missing pages from the police's case files as well. But then in September 1949, so about 2 years later, a grand jury convened to discuss inadequacies in the LAPD's homicide unit based on their failure to solve numerous murders, especially those of women and children, and one in particular being Elizabeth Short's. Now, I don't think it's a secret or debated much that during these early days, the LAPD were accused of a lot of corruption. According to Pew Eatwell, Sergeant Finis Brown was allegedly one of those corrupt cops, and he also had known ties to Mark Hansen. So according to Pew, if you go through the grand jury case, it is obvious that the grand jury is very, very suspicious and they're not happy with the evidence regarding the Dahlia case. And now we get into our first theory. Theory number 1, the killer was Mark Hansen, or that he orchestrated it. Okay, now according to Pew Eatwell, in her book Black Dahlia, Red Rose, in 1949, 2 years after the murder, Dr. Joseph Paul DeRiver, the LAPD's chief psychiatrist, received an anonymous letter signed with the pseudonym Jack Sand. Now, Jack Sand was offering information about the Black Dahlia murder. Now, it's got to just be mentioned quickly that over the years since the Black Dahlia's murder, there has been over 500 confessions from 500 different people saying that they are the one that killed the Black Dahlia. Some of these idiots weren't even born when she was murdered. Now, on top of those 500 confessions, there have been even more tip-offs from people saying that one of their family members killed the Black Dahlia. But when it comes to a criminal investigation, especially like a homicide, police do have tactics to be able to eliminate these tips or confessions very easily. Now, apparently, the reason that the letter from Jack Sand stood out is because it allegedly contained details which were not public. So the police then very quickly traced the letter back to a guy named Leslie Dillon, who, according to Pew, was a one-time mortuary assistant, which of course could explain the surgical bisection. Sort of, I suppose. However, this was not the first letter that Leslie Dillon sent to Dr. DeRiver. He also sent him another one, offering him help on a book about sadism due to his interest in psychopathic cases, such as the unsolved Black Dahlia. Well, this is awkward. I just find mysteries interesting, and so do you, that's why you're watching this. Well, anyway, like I said, Dillon seemed to know a lot of disturbing details about the murder that the police had kept secret, and said that he believed that Elizabeth Short had been murdered in a motel room. Now, Leslie Dillon wasn't confessing, but he was suggesting that an acquaintance of his named Jeff Connors may have killed Elizabeth Short as revenge after she threatened to reveal, quote, an affair not considered proper by the average person. However, Dr. De Rivers just believed that Jeff Connors was nothing more than a projection of Leslie Dillon's imagination. But after holding Leslie Dillon for a week, the LAPD released him because they actually found Jeff Connors. He was real. But Connors offered conflicting statements about his own connection to Elizabeth Short. So in the end, Connors too was released. So they just let both of these guys go, even though Leslie Dillon supposedly knew things that he shouldn't have known. Jesus Christ, man, the LAPD seriously were like the real-life police squad.
I can't kick you off the force, Frank. It's just not fair.
I know, Ed. Life isn't always fair. Just think the next time I shoot someone, I could be arrested. Hey, look at that. The missing evidence in the Kellner case. My God, he was innocent.
He went to the chair 2 years ago, Frank.
Anyway, after Pugh's book came out, a retired member of the Long Beach Police Department named Buzz Williams told Pugh that his father, Richard F. Williams, had served on the LAPD's Gangster Squad, which was the team originally tasked with investigating Elizabeth Short's murder, and Richard Williams also thought that Leslie Dillon was the killer. Interestingly, another Gangster Squad member named Con Keller also believed that Dillon was involved, but not necessarily the killer. He just believed that he was present for the murder, but that Mark Hansen was the killer. Buzz Williams believes that they all conspired together to kill Elizabeth Short when she became aware of a hotel robbery scam that they were involved in. Oh god, so it is like Sin City. Well, could that be the affair not considered proper for the average person? Possibly. Now, allegedly, I am saying that a lot in this video. Allegedly, Mark Hansen was connected with a criminal gang whose MO was that a member of this gang would get a job as a bellhop at a hotel. He would then stake the place out and find where the safes are hidden, and then he would quit his job. Then a few days or weeks later, the gang would come in and rob the place. Now, personally, I don't doubt that people do this. However, if you were going to be a criminal, I'm pretty sure there are faster and easier ways of making money, unless what were they expecting? Like some idiots left his Rolex in the hotel safe for like a stack of $10,000. It's weird. Anyway, Pugh Eatwell suggests that Leslie Dillon murdered Elizabeth Short at the request of Mark Hansen. And this could be for one of two reasons. Either because she was asking him for money all the time and he became annoyed at this and then basically said to his entourage, can somebody get rid of this girl? And they misinterpreted that. Or because she needed to be silenced about this hotel scam. And then for whatever reason, they try to pin this murder on Jeff Connors. Now, it is important to remember two things. Antoth reported that Elizabeth was scared about something and crying all the time. Now, it is also important to remember that the last time they reportedly saw her was November 1946. That is 3 months before she was killed. The second thing to remember is that at this point, it had already been 2 years and the case was considered cold. If they killed her, they had gotten away with it. So why would Leslie Dillon send the letter? I don't know. I feel bad laughing. It's a wild accusation. Anyway, Dillon said that it happened at a motel, and Pugh Eatwell believes that they killed Elizabeth at the Astor Motel, where Leslie Dillon had reportedly been staying, and where motel owners Henry and Clara Hoffman admitted finding one of their cabins covered in blood and fecal matter. And that day they found it was January 15th, 1947, the same day that Elizabeth's body was found mutilated. Apparently, witnesses who stayed at the motel at the time also recalled seeing a dark-haired girl who resembled Elizabeth Short, as well as a man who fit Mark Hansen's description. Eatwell goes on to say, quote, I'm 99% confident on the basis of the evidence I see, there was definitely a cover-up. Even as I was going through the documents, pages were just missing and removed, and they're almost always connected somehow to Leslie Dillon or Mark Hansen. She goes on to say that there are very serious questions about Leslie Dillon that just can't be answered. Elizabeth's shoes and purse were found dumped in the trash shortly after the murder by a local cafe owner, and that was actually 2 blocks away from where Leslie Dillon lived. And the park where her body was found is one that he knew very well, and in fact used that park as a shortcut to get to where he lived. She went on to insist that Dillon, as an aspiring writer, allegedly preserved newspaper clippings about violence against women. She also claims that Ann Toth and a model friend of hers named Ardis Green reportedly identified Leslie Dillon as one of Elizabeth Short's boyfriends. Pugh Eatwell added, "If you look at the examples of Dillon's so-called creative writing, his insecurity is reflected in those. Everything fits together into this picture of someone who has a huge inferiority complex and a physical hatred of women." However, Dillon was released by the police due to a lack of evidence, and he would go on to live a relatively quiet life until his death in 1988. As for Mark Hansen, Eatwell claims that he remained on the police suspect list for the rest of his life, but he was never charged. Hansen died in 1964. Strangely though, Leslie Dillon did go on to name his first daughter Elizabeth. Now that was pretty weird. The first time I read it, I was like, wow, I think she actually did it. That is very convincing. But then I thought about it for a bit and I went digging, and then I found Larry Harnish. Theory number 2. Pugh Eatwell is wrong. It was actually a surgeon named Walter Bailey. Now I've linked the website in my description where Larry Harnish makes a few counterpoints to Pugh's theory. Now one of the points he made is that those who had known Dr. DeRiver considered him nothing more but a meddling crackpot. Oh man. Anyway, he replied to a Reddit post discussing Eatwell's theory with, quote, "Pugh Eatwell had to overlook a mountain of exculpatory evidence to incriminate Leslie Dillon. Investigators spent an incredible amount of time to determine that Dillon was actually in San Francisco when Elizabeth Short was killed. The district attorney's final report on the case says the inquiry eliminated Dillon as a suspect. A few facts. Leslie Dillon wasn't a morgue attendant. He was an ambulance driver for a few weeks. Leslie Dillon had no connection to Mark Hansen. Mark Hansen had no involvement in what passed for organized crime in Los Angeles. Let me also say that the Black Dahlia case was a state-of-the-art investigation for 1947. It's quite easy for fastback authors and armchair detectives to say, tut tut, the police were inept, the police were corrupt, not at all true." Okay. He goes on to say that anybody who relies on nothing more than Pugh Eatwell's book is at a tremendous disadvantage. Very few people have the district attorney's files, so they don't know what she ignored. Larry Harnish claims that he has almost all of the material, so I guess we're gonna have to take his word for it. He also goes on to say that the average person who doesn't have independent knowledge on the Black Dahlia case cannot imagine the magnitude of lies and distortions in the books that have been published. That of course goes for Steve Hodell's 2-decade campaign of exploiting his LAPD career to cash in on his father by making him a jet-set serial killer flying from the Philippines to be the Zodiac. Lying about George Hodel has become the family business. Black Dahlia Avenger, I Am the Night, and Roots of Evil are just a grift to sell books and get on TV. End quote. This guy has no mercy. Okay, so what does Larry Harnish think then? Well, he suggests that a deceased surgeon named Walter Bailey was the killer. Now, after I lay out some points here, I think you'll see why Walter Bailey is actually quite a compelling suspect. Walter Bailey had family connections to Elizabeth Short. Bailey's daughter also knew Elizabeth's sister and brother-in-law. There is also a photo, if I can find it I'll put it up on the screen, that Larry Harnish found of Elizabeth Short's sister Virginia and Walter Bailey's daughter at Virginia's wedding. Walter Bailey's daughter even signed Virginia's marriage license, and the address listed is that of Walter Bailey's. Now, just because they may have known each other does not mean that Walter Bailey killed her. However, Walter Bailey did have an office a few blocks away from the Biltmore Hotel, supposedly the last place where Elizabeth was seen alive. However, DA files have said that she was seen for a couple of days after she was dropped off by Red Manley. So, who knows? However, Harnish argues that Short, destitute and alone on a cold January evening, sought refuge in Walter Bailey's company. At the time though, Walter Bailey was suffering from a severe brain lesion, in an area of the brain that is known to alter behavior and make people more violent, and people who knew him said it was very weird how different he was acting in the last stages of his life. Yeah, he died pretty soon after all of this in 1948. During the last years of his life, Bailey also left his wife just before Elizabeth's murder to have a relationship with a physician that he worked with named Alexandra Partica. Now, the final blow here is it's pretty bad. Larry Harnish further speculates that after killing Elizabeth, Walter Bailey placed her body there in Leimert Park specifically to frighten his family. His ex-wife lived a mere 45-second walk away from where Elizabeth was found. Fucking hell, man. Yeah. Another interesting thing another thing to say is Walter Bailey was known to sit up late at night and watch surgery films. What the fuck, dude? Now, yeah, that's weird, right? Now, when I read that, I was like, damn, I think he did it. I think Larry Harnish actually did it. That is even more convincing than Pew Eatwell. But then, I found Steve Hodell's book, The Black Dahlia Avenger, that completely dismisses Larry Harnish's theory, and claims that his father, Dr. George Hodell, was the Black Dahlia's killer. However, nobody really cares about what Steve thinks, and a Los Angeles Times reviewer called the book a piece of meretricious, revolting twaddle. Why would a retired LAPD homicide detective with 24 years of experience write such gobbledygook? Now, before I move on with Steve Hodell's theory, I do want to just say that I think Larry Harnish, he's got some good points here, he's got some good stuff. I don't know if his book has come out yet. From what I was reading, it did say that he's working on one, so I'm not sure, I'm sorry, but hey, it sounds like it's gonna be fucking good. Anyway, let's move on. Steve Hodell has accused his old man George Hodell of a lot of things, including being the Zodiac Killer and the Lipstick Killer, and for the most part from what I've seen online, people don't really believe what he's saying. But, that said, I'll cover it for you anyway, so at least you're all caught up. Theory number 3. Steve Hodell is almost certainly wrong, but he says that George Hodell killed Elizabeth Short. Now before I begin, this theory does sound good on paper, but it does have some big holes in it. In 1949, George Hodell first came under suspicion, mostly because he was accused of doing some really fucking revolting shit, impregnating his 14-year-old daughter Tamar, after which she was apparently given a back alley abortion. 3 witnesses then came forward, 2 of whom admitted to participating in the acts themselves. Then at the widely publicized trial, 2 of the witnesses testified, but the 3rd recanted her earlier testimony, and she refused to take the stand. Now some people, probably Steve, believe that Hodell threatened this witness.
Where did you get that preposterous hypothesis? Did Steve tell you that perchance? Steve.
Anyway, her refusal to take the stand did result in his acquittal, and many started to believe that his daughter had just made up the allegations for attention. But it was this case that first brought Hodell to the attention of the LAPD. Because of the nature of the crime, and the belief that a doctor was involved, Hodell was now considered a potential suspect. He was also interviewed as a suspect in the June 1949 murder of Louis Springer, also known as the Green Twig murder. However, since there was no evidence implicating him, no charges were filed against him. But that is not all, because George Hodell was also suspected to be involved in the death of his secretary in 1945, a woman named Ruth Frances Spaulding, even though she was found dead in her home, having overdosed on sleeping pills, in what appeared to be an attempt to end her life. Now, can a person force another to swallow enough pills to kill them? Maybe. But due to all of the suspicion on Hodell, the LAPD then bugged his private Hollywood residence on Franklin Avenue, and he was monitored by 18 different detectives. They were waiting patiently for Hodell to make incriminating comments about his involvement in any of these homicides. On just the second day of the operation, February 19, 1950, they caught something. It was a woman screaming. Then later that same day, Hodell was overheard talking to a confidant, saying, quote, "Realize there was nothing I could do. Put a pillow over her head and cover her with a blanket. Get a taxi. Expired at 12:59. Then a little later, Hodell says, quote, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary because she's dead. They thought there was something fishy. Anyway, now they may have figured it out. Killed her. Maybe I did kill my secretary." End quote. Well, why would the police need to ask your secretary about a woman who died 2 years after her? Honestly, man, I don't know what's going on here. Now, Hodell's only real connection to Elizabeth Short would have been the fact that he is a doctor, given the hypothesis that whoever bisected her had some degree of surgical skill.
Where did you get that preposterous hypothesis?
But Hodell was also prone to having short flings, and apparently, 8 witnesses later suggested such a relationship existed between him and Elizabeth Short. Now, I don't know where this claim comes from about the 8 witnesses, maybe Steve.
Steve.
Now, while some photographs were found in Hodell's possession that seem to show a woman that resembles Elizabeth Short, they have widely been debunked, and it's said that the woman appears more similar to Ruth Spalding. Ultimately though, no one can be sure who the woman really is. So needless to say, he was never charged with the crime due to a lack of evidence, and Hodell left the US for the Philippines in 1950. He only came back to California in about 1990, suggesting that he wasn't actually the Zodiac, where he lived until his death in 1999. Unfortunately, I think we all know that the Black Dahlia murder case will probably never get solved. It's too old, it's too cold, a lot of these witnesses and people have died, so of course the closest we can get to an actual answer is theories. And I must admit that I think Larry Harnish's theory is pretty convincing. So I'm pretty interested to see, as he researches more, what information he actually finds. Who do you think is the most likely suspect here? Mark Hansen, Leslie Dillon, Walter Bailey, or the Zodiac Killer? Anyway, I'll see you next time with another Unsolved Mystery. Thanks for watching.